Have you ever thought of the beach as the safest escape? Soft sand, crashing waves, and endless skies. For most, it's paradise. But hidden beneath the beauty, some beaches hold terrifying secrets. From swimmers who vanish without a trace, to mysterious stalkers lurking after dark, and abandoned places that whisper with the dead. These are not myths, but chilling true accounts. Tonight, we dive into 3 disturbing TRU beach horror stories that will forever change the way you look at the shore. The day began like any picture, perfect summer scene. The sky stretched wide and cloudless, the sun hung bright and golden, and the waves carried a gentle rhythm that drew families, couples, and friends to the shoreline. The smell of salt and sunscreen lingered in the warm air, while children built castles in the sand, their laughter mixing with the cries of distant seagulls. Among the crowds was a group of friends, their excitement buzzing as they tossed down their towels, unfolded beach chairs, and unpacked coolers filled with cold drinks and snacks. The ocean called to them, inviting with its glittering surface, and one of them, a strong swimmer named Daniel, was the first to strip off his shirt and run headlong into the surf. His friends cheered, some following him splashing into the shallows, while others stayed behind, soaking in the sun. Daniel was always the adventurous one, the kind of person who thrived on pushing limits, and the ocean was no exception. He swam further than most dared, diving beneath the waves, cutting through the water with ease. His friends kept an eye on him at first, their laughter echoing as they watched him drift farther out, but they trusted his skill. He had been on the swim team in high school and even competed in open water events, so no one felt worried. Still, as the minutes passed, someone shaded their eyes and pointed. Daniel was farther than they expected him to be, almost a small speck against the horizon, bobbing with the swell. The sun burned hotter, the tide shifted, and the waves grew choppier as if the ocean itself had changed its mood. A couple of his friends called out, their voices carried weakly over the sound of the surf. Daniel lifted an arm and waved, as if to reassure them, before continuing his swim. Then, in an instant that no one could fully register, he was gone. One moment he was there, a tiny figure rising and falling with the waves, and the next he had slipped beneath the surface. At first, they thought it was another dive, another playful trick. They waited, scanning the water for him to resurface. A few seconds stretched into half a minute, then into a full minute, and panic began to creep into their voices. They shouted his name, running closer to the shoreline, but the water answered only with its endless roar. 2 of his friends plunged into the sea, thrashing through the waves as they tried to reach the spot where they had last seen him. The ocean, however, was no longer kind. Its currents pulled hard, dragging them sideways, making it nearly impossible to stay on course. Every time they thought they caught a glimpse of him, it turned out to be nothing more than foam or the shadow of a wave. On the beach, people noticed the commotion and began to gather, some pulling out their phones, others searching for lifeguards. A whistle blew in the distance, and soon a lifeguard sprinted across the sand, diving headlong into the water with practiced speed. The crowd grew tense, a hush falling over them as they watched the lifeguard cut through the surf. Time seemed to bend, stretching painfully thin with every second Daniel failed to appear. The friends on shore were shaking, their voices breaking as they begged for him to come back up, clinging to the hope that any moment his head would break the surface, and he would laugh at how worried they had become. But the ocean kept swallowing, its movements too vast, too strong, too uncaring. The lifeguard dove again and again, vanishing beneath the waves, surfacing empty-handed each time. More lifeguards arrived, rescue boards slicing through the water, their red floats stark against the darkening sea. The beach, once alive with joy, fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the siren of an approaching rescue vehicle. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding their eyes, while the friends stood numb, their towels and drinks forgotten in the sand. The minutes ticked by, every one of them heavier than the last, as the reality sank deeper into their minds. Something was terribly, terribly wrong, and the ocean was not giving him back. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of deep orange and purple that slowly faded into the dark canvas of night. The once crowded beach had emptied, the laughter of children and the rhythmic crash of the waves giving way to the occasional rustle of wind through tall grasses and the faint hum of crickets nearby. Streetlights flickered weakly in the distance, casting long, broken shadows on the sand. It was the kind of evening that felt calm and endless, perfect for a late stroll, and Emma, a young woman traveling alone for the weekend, thought nothing of it when she decided to wander by the shoreline after dinner. She slipped off her sandals, and let the cool sand sink between her toes, the sound of the waves steady and soothing against the quiet of the night. For the first few minutes, she felt entirely at peace. The stars shimmered faintly above, and the moonlight cast a silver glow on the water, turning each wave into a glistening sheet that rolled up and receded like breath. She carried her phone loosely in her hand, checking it every so often, but for the most part she just listened to the rhythm of the sea. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, a strange sensation crept over her. The hairs on the back of her neck rose, and her chest tightened as if her instincts were whispering that something wasn't quite right. She paused, glancing around the beach. It was empty, or at least it seemed so. Her eyes scanned the darkened dunes, the shadows beyond the waterline, but nothing moved. Telling herself it was just nerves, she shook her head and kept walking. But then came the crunch, a soft sound, almost drowned out by the waves, but unmistakable. Footsteps pressed into the sand somewhere behind her. She froze, listening, and the sound stopped. Slowly, she turned, her eyes narrowing as she searched the length of the beach. Again, she saw no one, only her own footprints trailing back toward the path she had come from. Her breath quickened, and she told herself she was imagining things, that perhaps it had been a gull or a loose shell shifting in the tide. She forced a smile, trying to dispel the unease, and kept moving, though now her steps were quicker and her ears tuned to every sound. It wasn't long before she heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. The crunch of sand under steady, deliberate weight, not close enough to touch, but not far enough to dismiss. Someone was there, trailing her just beyond the reach of the moonlight. She spun around once more, her voice breaking as she called out a shaky, "Hello." The silence that followed pressed against her ears, heavy and suffocating. No answer came, no figure revealed itself, but the feeling of eyes on her back only intensified. Her pulse raced, her phone clutched tightly now in her sweaty hand, thumb hovering over the emergency dial as her gaze darted from shadow to shadow. Emma's mind ran wild with possibilities. Maybe it was another late night walker, maybe a harmless fisherman heading home, maybe even her imagination playing cruel tricks. But deep inside, her gut screamed something darker. She picked up her pace, her bare feet kicking up sand as she tried to put distance between herself and the unseen follower. The sound of footsteps mirrored hers, faster now, closing the gap each time she dared to slow down. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps as panic wrapped itself around her. The beach stretched endlessly ahead, the nearest lights seeming further away with every step. The ocean on one side felt like a wall, vast and cold, and the dark dunes on the other seemed to swallow everything in shadows. Emma's mind fought to stay clear, searching for an escape. She veered toward the edge of the beach, aiming for the faint glow of the boardwalk, but the footsteps shifted too, moving with her, closer, heavier. She broke into a run, sand flying behind her, the night filling with the frantic sound of pursuit. She didn't dare look back, didn't want to see what was there, who was there, knowing only that something dangerous was closing in. Her phone slipped in her sweaty grip, and she fumbled to hold on as her lungs burned with the effort of running across the unstable ground. The waves crashed louder, almost as if the ocean itself were trying to drown out the sound of her fear, but she could still hear it, those relentless steps gaining ground. Her legs ached, her body screaming for her to stop, but adrenaline pushed her further, each step a desperate fight for safety. The boardwalk lights seemed to flicker, always just a little too far, the distance mocking her as she ran harder, knowing she couldn't keep it up forever, and that whatever hunted her in the shadows was not stopping. The search carried on for days, each one blending into the next as rescue crews, divers, and Coast Guard boats scarred the waters with growing desperation. The beach, once alive with laughter and the careless joy of summer, now carried an air of mourning. People avoided the spot where Daniel had last been seen, walking around it as if the sand itself carried some invisible mark. The friends, hollow-eyed and sleepless, stayed close to the shoreline, refusing to leave, convinced that something, anything, would eventually wash up or resurface. Yet each tide came and went without a trace, the ocean refusing to give back what it had taken. On the third evening, just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and painted the sky with streaks of deep red, a crowd gathered once more at the beach. Word had spread that something unusual had been spotted near the rocks that jutted out into the water. At first, it looked like driftwood or a tangle of seaweed, but as the waves rolled in, it became clear that it was something more. A limp figure swayed with the current, pale and twisted in the glow of the fading light. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as lifeguards rushed forward, dragging the body out of the surf and onto the sand. The friends froze, their hearts slamming in their chests, knowing before anyone spoke who it must be. Daniel's body was waterlogged, his skin waxy and gray, his limbs stiff as though he had been under for far longer than a few days. The most unsettling part was his expression. His eyes, though glazed and lifeless, were wide open, frozen in what looked like pure terror. His mouth was slightly parted, as if he had been screaming when the water claimed him. The crowd hushed into silence, the only sounds the rush of waves and the muted sobs of his friends. Even the lifeguards, hardened by years of rescues and recoveries, exchanged uneasy glances, whispering that he didn't look like someone who had simply drowned. The authorities arrived quickly, securing the scene, pushing the crowd back as they zipped the body into a bag. Questions buzzed like flies in the air. How had he reappeared so suddenly after being gone for days? Why did his body seem more decomposed than it should have been? No answers came, only theories, each one darker than the last. Some whispered about sharks, though his body bore no bite marks. Others mentioned strong currents pulling him into deep trenches, but that didn't explain the look on his face. His friends clung to each other, unable to tear their eyes away from the sand where he had lain, their grief tangled with confusion and an unshakable sense of fear. That night, none of them could sleep. The image of Daniel's lifeless face haunted them, burned into their memories. One of them swore they heard the sound of water dripping in their hotel bathroom, though everything was dry. Another woke gasping for air, dreaming of being pulled under by unseen hands. When morning finally came, they returned to the beach, seeking closure, but instead found only more unease. Locals avoided their gaze, muttering in hushed tones as the group walked by, as though they carried some curse with them. An old woman selling shells along the boardwalk whispered that the sea sometimes takes what it wants, and when it does, it leaves behind something that is no longer entirely human. The official report ruled it a drowning, the case closed with a few clinical words on paper, but the friends could not shake the sense that what happened to Daniel was not ordinary. Each of them remembered the moment they thought they saw him out in the water days, after he had disappeared, an arm lifting, a head bobbing, as though he had been alive, still fighting. The memory gnawed at them. If he had already been gone, then what exactly had they seen? The idea lingered, heavy and chilling, that maybe it had not been him at all, but something else wearing his image. As the week ended, the group prepared to leave, their summer trip shattered into fragments of grief and unanswered questions. They stood together one last time at the edge of the shore, the waves lapping at their feet, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. The sea glittered beautifully under the rising sun, but to their eyes, it no longer looked like a place of joy. It was vast and merciless, a hungry mouth that had stolen their friend and spat him back in a form they barely recognized. And as they turned away, each of them carried the quiet terror that the ocean was not finished with them, yet the beach at night was a completely different world. Gone were the crowds of families and tourists, the umbrellas and coolers, the children's laughter and the cries of seagulls. Instead, the shoreline was cloaked in darkness, broken only by the silvery glow of the moon shimmering across the restless water. The wind carried a colder edge, whistling softly through the dunes, and the waves crashed louder in the stillness, as if the sea had grown bolder without the distraction of daylight. For Michael, who had chosen to take a walk after midnight to clear his mind, it felt both peaceful and eerie. The emptiness was intoxicating, the solitude wrapping around him like a heavy blanket, but beneath it was something else, something that stirred unease in the pit of his stomach. He walked slowly, his shoes dangling from one hand, his bare feet sinking into the damp sand. The tide crept close to his ankles, retreating with a hiss each time, leaving behind dark glistening streaks that reflected the moonlight. At first, he welcomed the isolation, thinking of it as a perfect escape from the noise of the world. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cool night air and breathed deeply, the salty scent filling his lungs. Everything about the scene seemed calm, yet his instincts told him otherwise. Every shadow along the dunes seemed deeper than it should be. Every crash of a wave felt just a little too loud. Every whisper of the wind carried something that sounded almost like footsteps. Michael paused and turned his head, scanning the darkness behind him. The beach stretched out empty, his footprints trailing like a path into nothingness. He forced a nervous laugh at himself, muttering that he was letting his imagination get the best of him. But as he started walking again, the feeling only grew stronger. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation crawling up his spine, the undeniable weight of being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, each time telling himself there was nothing there, yet his pulse refused to settle. The moonlight illuminated the sand for several yards around him, but beyond that, the beach was swallowed by shadows. It was in that darkness that he felt something was hiding, matching his pace, lingering just out of sight. The crunch came next. A soft, deliberate sound in the sand that wasn't his own. Michael froze, his breath catching, his ears straining. He took a cautious step forward, and behind him came another step, perfectly timed, as though echoing him. His chest tightened, his skin breaking into goosebumps. He spun around, eyes darting wildly, but the beach remained empty. His rational mind tried to explain it away, the wind shifting the sand. Maybe a bird or a stray animal. But deep down he knew that wasn't the truth. He picked up his pace, heading toward the faint glow of the boardwalk lights in the distance. Each step he took was mirrored by that unseen presence, the sound of footsteps now unmistakable. They grew heavier, quicker, drawing closer, until Michael could almost feel the heat of someone just behind him. Panic surged through him, and he broke into a run, sand spraying beneath his feet as his breath came in ragged gasps. The waves crashed violently beside him, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching for him as he sprinted toward safety. He didn't dare look back, terrified of what he might see. His phone was in his pocket, but his trembling hands couldn't manage to pull it out while he ran. The boardwalk lights seemed further away with each step, the beach stretching endlessly, mocking his desperation. His lungs burned, his heart pounded, and still the footsteps chased him, relentless and closing in. For a moment, he thought he heard something else, a low whisper cutting through the night air, though the words were drowned out by the roar of the ocean. It sounded almost like his name. Michael stumbled, falling to his knees in the sand. The world spun around him, and for the first time, he forced himself to look back. But there was nothing there, only the dark beach and the marks of footprints that didn't belong to him, pressed deep into the sand and leading straight toward him before stopping abruptly a few feet away. His breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in terror. Slowly, he scrambled back to his feet, his legs shaking as he stumbled forward, desperate to reach the safety of the lights. The boardwalk finally drew closer, the hum of electricity and the faint murmur of night traffic promising relief. But even as he stepped onto the wooden planks, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows on the sand were still watching, waiting, patient enough to follow him again when he least expected it. The night had grown colder, the breeze sharper, and the boardwalk lights seemed dimmer than before. Michael tried to steady his breathing, gripping the wooden railing as he forced himself to believe he was safe now. The steady hum of the city behind him, the faint glow of distant neon signs, and the creak of the boards beneath his feet all felt like anchors pulling him back into reality. Yet the memory of those footprints trailing his own, stopping just a few steps away from where he had fallen, would not leave his mind. His hands shook as he pulled his phone from his pocket, intending to call someone, anyone, but the screen glared back with only a dead battery symbol. He cursed under his breath, slipping it back into his jacket, and began to walk quickly down the empty boardwalk, each groan of the planks beneath his weight echoing too loudly in the night. Every so often he glanced over the railing at the beach below. The sand stretched out in pale streaks under the moonlight, the waves pulling and retreating in their endless rhythm. It looked harmless from up here, almost peaceful, but Michael knew better. He could still hear the crunch of those steps in his head, the whispers hidden in the crash of the surf. Each time he looked, he expected to see someone standing down there, watching him, but the shoreline remained deserted. That should have brought comfort, yet instead it only deepened the dread curling in his chest. The absence felt wrong, as though the beach itself was holding its breath. As he walked further, the lights grew fewer, leaving longer stretches of shadow between the lamps. In one of those gaps, he heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but the faint scrape of wood against wood, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the planks behind him. He froze, every muscle tightening, his head turning slowly. Nothing but empty boardwalk stretched into darkness. His pulse hammered in his ears. He told himself it was the wind, the shifting boards, maybe even a stray piece of debris caught in the breeze. But then it came again, louder, closer, a dragging sound that carried weight. Michael's breath quickened, and he began to walk faster, his footsteps clattering against the boards. The sound followed him, matching his pace, dragging relentlessly behind him. He broke into a jog, the shadows whipping past, the faint pools of light from the lamps offering no real safety. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him as if the night itself were trying to slow him. He could feel something behind him now, close, too close, though he dared not look. The dragging had become a thud, like heavy boots slamming into the boards, each one landing in perfect rhythm with his own. When he reached a bend in the boardwalk, Michael swerved sharply, pressing himself against the railing and spinning around, ready to face whatever was following him. The path behind was empty, stretching back into darkness, but the sound stopped too. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom, searching for any movement, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening, the only sound the faint lapping of the tide below. Slowly, he stepped away from the railing, heart pounding, his body trembling with the tension of fight or flight. That was when he noticed the footprints again. They were wet, glistening in the weak glow of the nearest lamp, leading down the center of the boardwalk. Not his own, but larger, heavier, spaced in uneven strides as though whatever had made them dragged itself along with unnatural weight. They stopped only a few feet away from him, the last print darker, deeper, pressed as though something had stood there watching him before vanishing into thin air. Michael staggered back, his legs nearly giving out. His throat tightened, and every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape the stretch of boardwalk that seemed to bend under the weight of something unseen. He forced himself forward, sprinting now, the cold night air burning in his lungs. The lights flickered overhead, some going completely dark as he passed, plunging him into patches of suffocating shadow. He could hear it again, not footsteps this time but breathing, deep, raspy, guttural, just over his shoulder, as though someone were leaning close enough to whisper in his ear. He turned sharply, flailing his arms at empty air, but nothing was there. The boardwalk creaked violently beneath his feet, as though straining to hold more weight than just his own. Ahead, the end of the boardwalk came into view, leading toward the main road where cars passed and neon signs buzzed. Relief surged through him, and he pushed harder, desperate to reach the light and sound of life again. Yet as he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen ran alongside him, its presence brushing against him like cold fingers in the dark. He didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back, knowing that if he did, he might finally see what had been stalking him all along. The abandoned beach house stood at the far end of the coast, half hidden behind a line of windswept palms and dunes, its silhouette leaning awkwardly against the sky like a skeleton left to rot. The locals never went near it, claiming it had been empty for decades, though nobody seemed to know why. Some said a family once lived there until one summer when they vanished without a trace. Others whispered about strange lights seen in its windows at night, even though the place had no electricity. For years, it had been nothing more than a story told to scare tourists, but for Sarah and her friends, curiosity outweighed fear. They had heard the tales and decided that a late, night exploration of the crumbling house would be the perfect end to their beach trip. The air was still that evening, heavy with the scent of salt and seaweed, the sound of waves muffled by the dunes. As they approached the house, the laughter that had carried them there slowly died down. The building loomed larger than it had from a distance, its windows dark sockets staring blankly at them, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The porch creaked as they stepped onto it, each board threatening to splinter under their weight. Sarah touched the peeling paint of the wall, surprised by how damp and cold it felt, as though the house itself was breathing. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with the odor of mildew and rot. The floor was scattered with sand that had blown in through broken windows, and strange streaks of water stains climbed the walls like veins. Their flashlights cut thin beams through the dark, illuminating fragments of forgotten life, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall, a child's toy car buried in dust, a single wooden chair positioned oddly in the center of a room. None of it made sense, as though the house had been abandoned in a hurry, everything left to decay. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. Every creak of the floor made Sarah flinch, and every gust of wind against the broken shutters sounded like whispers. The others tried to joke, their voices forced and uneasy, but it only heightened the tension. When they reached the staircase, Sarah noticed something odd. Though the banister was coated in years of dust, there were smudges where it had been wiped clean, as though someone had recently touched it. Her stomach twisted, but she said nothing, not wanting to spook the group further. Upstairs, the air felt colder, the silence deeper. Their flashlights revealed rooms with peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards, but what unsettled them most were the signs of recent disturbance. A mattress leaned against a wall as if dragged there, a broken lamp lay across the floor, and faint footprints marked the dust near a doorway. The prints were uneven, some larger than others, trailing into a dark room at the end of the hall. As they entered that room, a sudden gust of wind slammed a door shut somewhere behind them. The noise was deafening in the stillness, and their flashlights shook as they swung wildly, searching for the source. The room they stood in was nearly empty, except for a cracked dresser and a shattered window, but something about it felt wrong. The walls seemed damp, darker in places as though water had seeped through, and in one corner the plaster bulged outward unnaturally, as though something pressed from the other side. Then came the sound. A faint scratching, like nails dragging against wood, rising from beneath the floor. The group froze, their eyes darting to each other in silent terror. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, moving beneath their feet as though something was crawling under the boards. Sarah's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. She scrambled to turn it back on, her hands shaking, and when the beam returned, it landed on the mirror propped against the wall. For a split second, she saw something in its reflection that wasn't in the room. A figure standing just behind them, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. She screamed, stumbling back, and the others turned their lights toward the mirror, but the figure was gone. Their panic erupted, voices overlapping in fear, and the scratching from the floor grew violent, the boards beneath them groaning as though something was trying to break through. The air became colder, their breath visible in the beams of their flashlights, and an overwhelming stench of seawater filled the room. They bolted, crashing down the stairs, the house shaking with every step as if it were alive and furious. By the time they burst through the front door, the night air felt like salvation. They didn't stop running until the abandoned house was far behind them, its shadow still visible against the moonlit sky. Even as they caught their breath, hearts pounding, they could swear they still heard it. The faint, distant sound of scratching carried on the wind, following them down the beach. The night after fleeing the abandoned beach house, Sarah and her friends gathered in their rented cabin, trying to convince themselves that what they had experienced was nothing more than a trick of their imaginations. The wind, the creaking floors, the strange acoustics of an old structure. It could all be explained logically, they told themselves, though none of them truly believed it. The silence that fell between them was heavy, each lost in their own thoughts, replaying the sound of that scratching beneath the floorboards, the flicker of shadows that had no source, the figure that Sarah swore she had seen in the mirror. Every time one of them tried to laugh it off, the hollow sound only deepened their unease. Later that night, when the others had finally drifted into restless sleep, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the crash of waves in the distance. The ocean had always been a sound of comfort for her, but now it carried a sinister undertone, as if the tide was whispering. She rolled over to close her eyes, but a faint tapping noise caught her attention. It was coming from the cabin window, soft and rhythmic, like fingertips drumming on the glass. Her heart raced as she sat up, staring into the darkness. At first, she saw only her reflection in the glass, pale and frightened, but then her breath caught as she noticed something else. Beyond her reflection, faint and blurred by the moonlight, a tall figure stood on the beach, motionless, facing the cabin. She gasped, scrambling to wake her closest friend, but when they looked together, the figure was gone. Her friend muttered angrily about being woken for nothing, but Sarah knew what she had seen. Sleep was impossible after that. She sat by the window until dawn, watching the empty beach, every shadow twisting into the shape of that figure in her mind. The next morning, the group decided to leave early, their trip cut short by fear they couldn't name aloud. As they loaded their bags into the car, one of the boys noticed something strange near the cabin steps. Prints in the sand. Long, heavy, uneven, leading from the dunes up to the very edge of the porch. They looked too large to be human, yet they carried the shape of a barefoot stride. Nobody said anything at first, each waiting for someone else to dismiss it as a prank or the tracks of a drunken wanderer. But deep down they all knew those prints were fresh, and they hadn't been there the night before. On the drive out of town, silence hung over them. Each bump of the road, each groan of the tires on sand made them twitch. Sarah stared out the window at the coastline as it receded, a part of her feeling as though they weren't leaving the place behind, but taking something of it with them. The others seemed to feel the same, their nervous glances betraying the unease they were too afraid to voice. By the time they reached the highway, a heavy storm rolled in, rain battering the windshield, wind howling like a chorus of voices. The ocean was no longer in sight, but its presence felt closer than ever. That night, after dropping the others home, Sarah returned to her own house, exhausted but unable to rest. She moved through her rooms checking doors and windows, ensuring every lock was secure. Yet the sense of being watched never left her. She left the television on for comfort, but even the flickering light felt distorted, shadows stretching unnaturally long across her walls. Finally, she collapsed onto the couch, hoping sleep would claim her. It did, but not peacefully. In her dream, she was back at the beach house, standing in the upstairs hallway with the bulging plaster wall and the mirror leaning in the corner. The scratching beneath the floor was louder than before, violent, shaking the boards under her feet. She tried to run, but her legs refused to move, her body rooted to the spot. In the mirror, she saw not only herself but the same figure she had glimpsed outside the cabin, standing behind her, its hollow eyes glowing faintly like embers. It raised a hand and pressed it against her shoulder in the reflection, but she felt the cold weight of its grip in reality. She screamed, jolting awake, her body drenched in sweat, her shoulder atching as if bruised. The television had gone to static, the room awash in flickering light. On the screen, through the haze of black and white noise, she thought she saw a shape forming, stretched and shifting like something pressing against the glass. The faint sound of scratching filled the air, not from beneath her floor this time, but from inside her walls. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more insistent, crawling closer with every passing second. The days that followed were filled with an unease that Sarah couldn't shake. Her friends had gone back to their lives, each of them pretending to move on. Yet the shadows of what they had experienced clung to them. Messages exchanged in their group chat carried a tone of denial, filled with jokes and casual words that felt hollow. But underneath the humor was silence about the beach house, silence about the footprints, silence about the figure that seemed to follow them even after leaving the coast behind. Sarah tried to return to her routine, but everywhere she went she felt eyes on her. In the grocery store, she caught her reflection in the freezer door glass and swore she saw a figure standing over her shoulder. At night, the scratching returned faintly, not constant, but always enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. One evening, desperate for normalcy, she invited two of her closest friends from the trip over for dinner. They agreed reluctantly, arriving with tense smiles, their eyes darting around as if expecting something to happen. They tried to eat, tried to talk about school and work and trivial things, but the effort fell flat. Finally, one of them admitted what Sarah had feared to hear. She said she had been hearing things too. Whispers at night when she was alone, the feeling of someone brushing against her in the dark when no one was there. The other confessed that she had woken to find damp sand scattered across her bedroom floor. Though her windows had been locked, they fell silent after that, staring at each other with the shared understanding that none of them had escaped whatever they had stirred in that house. Later that night, after her friends left, Sarah sat alone in the dim kitchen, staring at the floor where her friends' damp shoes had left prints. Something about the sight unsettled her more than it should have. She rose to clean them, and as she did, her light flickered, casting her shadow long and thin against the wall. For a moment she froze, because there was another shadow beside hers, taller, darker, moving though she stood still. She spun around, hard hammering, but the kitchen was empty. Sleep that night came in fragments, restless and shallow. Each time she drifted off, she was pulled into the same dream. The beach stretched endlessly before her, empty yet filled with the sound of footsteps. She turned and saw the figure standing at the shoreline, watching its shape blurred by mist. No matter how far she ran, it was always behind her, closing the distance. Each time she woke gasping, convinced the sound of footsteps lingered in her room, her breath forming pale clouds in the sudden chill. The following day she tried to convince herself to go outside, to shake off the dread. She wandered into town, the streets bustling with life, yet she felt detached from it, as though the world had dimmed around her. In the crowd, she caught glimpses of that same figure, reflected in shop windows, standing across the street, disappearing the moment she blinked. Nobody else seemed to notice. At one point, she ducked into a bookstore to steady her nerves, only to find sand scattered across the floor between the aisles, damp and gritty, leading nowhere. She left quickly, her pulse racing, certain now that the thing was no longer tied to the beach. It had followed her everywhere. That evening, Sarah sat on her couch with the lights off, too drained to move, staring at the flickering television screen. The static had returned again, a faint gray hum filling the room, and once more she thought she saw movement in it. A shape trying to form, pressed against the glass, stretching, twisting. She forced herself to switch it off, plunging the room into silence, but the scratching returned almost immediately. This time it wasn't muffled by walls or distant enough to ignore. It was right behind her. The sound of nails dragging slowly across wood, deliberate and steady, as though something wanted her to know it was there. She turned her head slowly, every muscle screaming against the movement, but saw nothing except the empty corner of her living room. Her phone buzzed suddenly, the shrill sound making her jump. She snatched it up, relief flooding her chest at the sight of her friend's name. But when she answered, no words came through, only a rush of static. Her breath caught as she held the phone to her ear, and then faintly, through the distortion, she heard her name whispered. Not in her friend's voice, but in the same hollow tone she had heard in her dream. She dropped the phone, backing away, her body trembling. In the reflection of the dark television screen, she saw it again. A figure standing just behind her, still impatient, its presence filling the room though the space around her remained empty. Her throat tightened, and though she wanted to scream, no sound came out. The final chapter of the story opens with Sarah on the verge of collapse. She had not slept properly for nights, her mind caught between reality and nightmares that bled into one another. The figure that had haunted her since the beach house was no longer a shadow on the edges of her vision. It was there with her, in every corner, in every reflection, a constant presence that tightened its grip the longer she tried to ignore it. Her friends had grown distant, each retreating into silence, as the experiences became too heavy to share. They were united in fear but isolated in their suffering, each visited by the same scratching, the same shadows, the same chill of the unseen. One evening, unable to bear it anymore, Sarah decided to return to where it all began. She convinced herself that if the presence had followed them from the abandoned house, maybe it could also be left there again, sealed within the rotting walls where they had disturbed it. She called her friends, and though reluctant, 2 of them agreed to come, their voices shaking but resigned to the same conclusion. Whatever had awakened was not going to leave them alone until they faced it. They drove through the night back to the coast, the sound of the ocean growing louder the closer they came. The beach stretched before them under a pale moon, empty and endless, the air colder than it should have been. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the horizon, as if waiting for their return. Every step they took toward it felt like walking into a trap, but turning back was no longer an option. Inside, the house was darker than before, the air thick and wet, smelling of salt and decay. Their flashlights revealed the same broken furniture, the same warped walls, yet everything felt altered, as though the house itself had grown aware of them. They moved cautiously, the floorboards groaning under their weight, until they reached the room upstairs, the room with the mirror. It was still there, propped against the wall, though cracked even further, its surface warped like rippling water. The scratching began almost instantly, rising from beneath the floor and spreading to the walls, encircling them. The sound was deafening, no longer subtle but furious, as if the house itself were alive. They backed toward one another, clutching their flashlights tightly, their breaths ragged. Sarah forced herself to stare at the mirror, convinced that the figure was waiting within it, and she was right. The reflection showed not 3 terrified people, but 4. Standing just behind them was the tall, hollow-eyed shape, clearer now than it had ever been. Its eyes glowed faintly, its features twisted and stretched like something that had once been human, but was now corrupted by the sea. Before they could move, the mirror began to tremble, cracks spreading across its surface. A sound like rushing water filled the room, and from the cracks spilled dark, brackish liquid, pooling on the floor and soaking into the boards. The smell of salt and rot was overwhelming. The figure in the reflection raised its hand, pressing it against the glass, and the surface rippled outward like a pond. Sarah screamed at her friends to run, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the house shaking around them. One of her friends bolted down the stairs, the other frozen in terror. Sarah grabbed her arm, pulling with all her strength, but the mirror burst with a deafening crack. The figure stepped forward, no longer trapped in glass, but rising from the water that poured across the room. It was immense, its movements jerky and unnatural, and with every step the house groaned as though it would collapse. Sarah and her friend stumbled down the stairs, the walls around them shuddering, pieces of plaster falling as they fled. The sound of footsteps followed, impossibly loud, shaking the ground as though the ocean itself was chasing them. They burst out of the house into the night, the third friend already screaming for them to hurry. Behind them, the abandoned house began to buckle, windows shattering, the roof sinking inward as if being dragged into the earth. A final crash echoed across the beach, followed by silence. The figures swallowed along with the crumbling house. The sand trembled under their feet, then stilled, leaving nothing but the sound of waves breaking calmly on the shore. For a long time, they stood frozen, staring at the ruins of the place that had cursed them. Nothing remained but a heap of splintered wood, and a faint pool of seawater glistening under the moonlight. The scratching had stopped, the whispers were gone, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt still and empty. They did not speak, only turned back toward their car, knowing without saying it that they would never return here, never again set foot near this beach. In the weeks that followed, the haunting presence faded. The shadows no longer lingered in reflections, the whispers no longer crept through the walls, and the scratching was nothing more than a memory. Yet the experience left scars they would carry forever, a reminder that not every story told by locals is just a story, and that some places are abandoned for a reason. The ocean returned to being a place of beauty for others, but for them, it would always be the sound of something waiting, hidden beneath the waves, biding its time for the next curious soul to wander too close. Thank you for joining me through these terrifying true accounts. Beaches are often seen as places of peace, but as we've discovered tonight, sometimes the most beautiful places can hide the darkest secrets. If you enjoyed these stories, stay with me for more chilling tales, and remember, always listen to the warnings, because not every shore welcomes you home.